A tray slides across the table. White rice, meat, vegetables. The prisoner stares at it. He does not move. He does not thank them. He does not eat, because he thinks he understands what this means. In his world, white rice is not ordinary food. It is precious, ceremonial, sometimes sacred, and sometimes it belongs to the dead. In Japanese tradition, a bowl of white rice could be placed at funerals, on family altars, as an offering to those who had passed on. So when an American guard set down a tray with white rice in front of a captured Japanese soldier, some prisoners did not see mercy. They saw ritual. They thought this was their last meal. They thought execution would come next. That is how deep the fear ran. That is how complete the lie had become. Because these men had been taught something very simple. If you surrendered, you would be tortured. If you were captured, you would be mutilated. If the Americans took you alive, they would kill you anyway. They had been told the enemy was not human, not civilized, not honorable, not capable of mercy. And then the enemy offered them rice. Not a beating, not a knife, not a firing squad. Rice. And for some Japanese prisoners of war, that moment did more than fill an empty stomach. It shattered an entire worldview, because the war had trained them to expect death. But captivity gave them something more disturbing. It gave them kindness. And sometimes, kindness is hardest to understand when you have been raised inside a system built on shame, fear, and sacrifice. The story of Japanese POWs in American hands is not just a story about prison camps. It is a story about collision. Code against reality. Propaganda against experience. Starvation against abundance. And at the center of it all sits one bowl of white rice, waiting to be understood. Japan's military culture in the Second World War treated surrender as a moral collapse, not just a defeat, a disgrace. The most famous expression of that idea came in 1941, in the Senjinkun, the field service code issued under War Minister Hideki Tojo. Its message was blunt. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. That line mattered, because it did not merely encourage bravery, it redefined survival as dishonor. It told soldiers that capture was worse than death, that if you lived after surrender, you had not really lived at all. This was not abstract philosophy. It was drilled into men through training, discipline, and social pressure. Bushido, the idealized warrior code, was invoked as a moral weapon, not always in its older, more complex historical form, but in a simplified wartime version, a harder version, a weaponized version, one that glorified obedience, endurance, self-destruction in service of the state. Japanese soldiers were not simply taught to fight. They were taught that surrender would stain their family name. That capture would bring shame to parents, wives, children, ancestors. That a prisoner was no longer a proper man, no longer worthy of respect. This is why many who did surrender gave false names, not because they expected to escape, but because they feared the consequences of being known. They believed their families would suffer for their survival, and they had reason to think so. The system around them made shame public. It made death noble and survival suspect. This helps explain one of the strangest and darkest patterns of the Pacific War. In many battles, Japanese surrender rates were extraordinarily low, sometimes below 1%. In Western armies, a surrounded force might surrender in large numbers, 20%, 30%, sometimes more. That was not seen as honorable, perhaps, but it was recognized as human. In the Imperial Japanese Army, human instinct had to fight ideology, and ideology often won. Men killed themselves with grenades. Officers ordered hopeless charges. Wounded soldiers dragged themselves into caves and waited to die. others leaped from cliffs, not because they preferred death in any free sense, but because they had been cornered inside a moral prison. They believed the enemy waiting below was worse than the void, and propaganda fed that terror every day. Americans were depicted as monsters, as beasts, as demons. The word kichiku carried that meaning. Demons and beasts, not just enemies. Creatures beyond civilized restraint. Men who would torture captives, desecrate bodies, laugh at suffering. Once that image is planted deeply enough, surrender stops looking like survival. It starts looking like a slower form of dying. So when Japanese soldiers refused capture, it is tempting to call it fanaticism and stop there. But that misses something important. Many were not choosing freely. They were trapped, inside a code, inside a fear, inside a state-built mythology that made death feel clean and life feel polluted. And then came the islands. The islands where this code met hunger. Because Imperial Japan did not just ask its soldiers to die. Very often, it failed to feed them first. Nowhere was that failure more brutal than in the Pacific campaigns, where supply collapsed. Japanese forces were scattered across vast distances of ocean, remote islands, isolated garrisons, long, vulnerable sea routes. And once American naval and air power began choking those routes, whole armies were left to decay in place. On Guadalcanal, the disaster became legendary. Only a fraction of supplies sent from Rabaul ever arrived, roughly 20%. The rest were sunk, scattered, or lost. The result was not just military weakness, it was starvation. Around 10,000 Japanese soldiers starved to death there, not killed in battle, not cut down in charges. Starved. Slowly. Bodies shrinking. Strength evaporating. Discipline eaten away by empty stomachs. Men reduced to searching for roots. Bark. Grass. Anything that might delay the inevitable. On other Pacific islands, the pattern repeated. Garrisons were ordered to hold positions that could no longer be supplied. The order remained. The food disappeared. The state demanded sacrifice from men it could no longer sustain. And those men suffered in silence because the code gave them almost no moral permission to admit reality. To surrender was shame. To retreat was shame. To survive too visibly was shame. So they starved in obedience. This is one of the great hidden contrasts of the Pacific War. Japan preached spiritual superiority, but it could not reliably feed its own soldiers. America, by contrast, arrived with industrial abundance on a scale that seemed unreal. C rations, K rations, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, Coca-Cola, even ice cream. American military logistics were so vast that floating ice cream barges operated in the Pacific. Floating ice cream factories in a war zone. That detail sounds absurd, almost comic, until you place it beside a Japanese infantryman chewing roots in the jungle. Then it stops being comic. It becomes a measurement of power. The United States built or improved more than 100 airfields across Pacific Islands. It moved millions of tons of supplies across thousands of miles of ocean. By 1945, the U.S. Navy was larger than all other navies in the world combined. America produced approximately 300,000 aircraft during the war. And all that industrial strength meant something very specific. It meant America could fight across 2 oceans and still feed enemy prisoners. Japan could not reliably feed men wearing its own uniform. That contrast matters. Because when Japanese POWs encountered American captivity, they were not just encountering different treatment. They were encountering a different civilization of logistics, a system so rich in material power that it could afford decency. And for starving men taught to expect barbarism, that abundance felt almost supernatural. Capture itself was often the breaking point. The moment when everything they had been told collided with what was actually happening. A Japanese soldier, sick, exhausted, hungry, perhaps wounded, is surrounded. He expects a rifle butt, a boot, a bullet. Instead, he is searched, guarded, processed, still terrified, because terror does not vanish when the beating fails to begin. It waits. Maybe later, he thinks. Maybe this is only the first step. Maybe the torture starts after dark. Then food arrives. And one of the most striking details in these encounters was the serving of white rice. The Americans were not performing a ritual. They were doing something practical. They knew Japanese soldiers preferred rice, and the American supply system had enough food to provide it. So rice appeared on POW trays alongside meat, vegetables, and sometimes dessert. In places like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Japanese POWs were fed well. Rice, meat, vegetables, adequate calories, regular meals. For men who had known island starvation, it was a stunning reversal. Some believed the white rice meant they were about to die, because in their symbolic world, white rice could accompany the dead. The misunderstanding was tragic and revealing. The Americans saw nutrition. The prisoners saw ceremony. The Americans meant ordinary care. The prisoners read finality. That is what happens when propaganda and culture have prepared a man for cruelty so completely that even generosity looks sinister. Many POWs went through the same emotional sequence: terror, then confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, painful reassembly of trust. Execution did not come. Beatings did not come. Instead, there were barracks, doctors, schedules, meals. Some prisoners remained suspicious for weeks. Others broke down quickly once they realized the pattern held, that the next meal came too, and the next one, and the next. The United States held around 50,000 Japanese POWs during the war. In camps such as Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, and Camp Huntsville in Texas, prisoners were contained, watched, and interrogated. But they were also fed and treated medically. In some camps, they maintained gardens. That detail is easy to miss. Gardens, an act of ordinary life, a patch of order grown inside captivity. There is something almost unbearable in that image. Men who had expected torture kneeling in American soil, growing things. Some gained weight in captivity. That fact alone tells its own story. Like many German POWs, Japanese prisoners sometimes became physically healthier behind barbed wire than they had been on the battlefield. Think about what that means: to be captured by the enemy and fed better than by your own army. To find more stability in prison than in service. To discover that surrender, the greatest disgrace you were ever taught to fear, might also be the first thing that keeps you alive. That realization did not produce immediate gratitude. It produced disorientation, a moral earthquake. Because once the Americans failed to act like demons, other lies became unstable too. That is where intelligence officers noticed something important. Respect worked. Not always. Not instantly. But far better than brutality. American interrogators found that prisoners who were treated decently often became more cooperative, not because they were weak, but because reality had cracked open the ideological shell they had lived inside. A man who has been told from birth that capture means torture, and then receives food and medical care instead, begins to question everything. And in that questioning, information emerges. American psychological warfare units understood this. Some cooperative POWs helped create surrender leaflets. Others broadcast appeals by loudspeaker to Japanese troops still holding out. These messages had force because they came from Japanese voices, not abstract promises from the enemy, but testimony from men who had already crossed the forbidden line and survived it. The leaflets described actual camp conditions, food, medical care, humane treatment, dignity. And that mattered, because for a starving Japanese soldier on an isolated island, facts were no longer theoretical. The promise of rice could be stronger than a speech about international law. The promise that you would not be beaten could be stronger than patriotism already collapsing under hunger. This was one of the cruelest ironies of the war. Japanese propaganda had worked so well that truth itself had to be smuggled back in by former prisoners, by men once condemned as disgraced, men whose survival now made them useful. And yet even after the war, the burden of surrender did not vanish. Some returning POWs were shunned. Communities remembered the old code. Families carried the stain. Survival still came wrapped in judgment. For others, though, the experience changed everything. Some became advocates of reconciliation, of American-Japanese friendship. Not because captivity was pleasant, not because the war was forgiven in some easy way, but because they had seen, firsthand, that the world was not arranged according to the myths they had been fed, that the enemy could show restraint, that dignity offered to a captive was real, that mercy was not weakness. And this returns us to the deeper contrast. The real enemy in this story was not simply the American soldier facing the Japanese prisoner across a table. The real enemy was the system that had poisoned the prisoner's expectations so thoroughly that a bowl of rice looked like a funeral offering. It was the code that told him death was cleaner than surrender, the propaganda that told him kindness was impossible, the military culture that could not feed him but could still shame him. America did not act out of pure innocence. War is never that simple. American forces fought with enormous violence across the Pacific, but the treatment of Japanese POWs revealed something Japan's wartime ideology could not easily explain. A society capable of immense destructive power was also capable of feeding its prisoners, of caring for wounded enemies, of discovering that intelligence gained through dignity could be more useful than anything beaten out through terror. And behind that moral difference stood an industrial one. The same nation that built fleets, airfields, and 300,000 aircraft also built a logistical machine powerful enough to keep food moving, medicine flowing, camps operating. Industrial power is not only measured in bombs dropped. Sometimes it is measured in the ability to place a full tray before a starving enemy. Rice, meat, vegetables, and to do it again tomorrow. Japan could tell its soldiers to die. America could feed even the men trying to kill it. That was not just a humanitarian contrast, it was a civilizational one. One system consumed its own soldiers in the name of honor. The other, for all its brutal force, had enough confidence and capacity to show restraint. And that is why the white rice mattered. Not because it was exotic, not because it was luxurious by American standards, but because to the prisoner receiving it, it overturned the moral grammar of war. He had been told the enemy were beasts. The beasts brought food. He had been told surrender meant disgrace. Disgrace kept him alive. He had been told capture ended honor. And yet in captivity, he was treated with more human regard than starvation had ever shown him. So imagine that moment again. The tray set down in silence, the prisoner staring, white rice gleaming in the bowl. He thinks of funerals, of ancestors, of the dead. He thinks this is the end. Then the minutes pass. No guard arrives to drag him away. No executioner enters. No ritual is completed. Only the food remains. Waiting. And slowly, the meaning changes. This is not an offering to the dead. It is food for the living. And that may have been the most shocking lesson of all. Not that Americans were kind. Not that propaganda had lied. Not even that surrender could spare a life. But that life itself had been made to look shameful by the men who sent him to war. The bowl of white rice exposed the cruelty of that deception. Because the meal was never really about food. It was about permission. Permission to survive. Permission to doubt. Permission to see the enemy as human and, in doing so, recover one's own humanity. That is why the story endures, because it strips war down to something intimate. Not a fleet, not a division, not a campaign arrow on a map. Just one frightened man. One tray of food. One moment when reality proves gentler than ideology. He picks up his chopsticks. His hand is still unsteady. He's still afraid. But he eats. And in that small act, an empire's lie begins to die. The white rice was not his last meal. It was the first time the war told him the truth.